April 1942. The Pacific was a sea of uncertainty and silence. Just months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the wounds of humiliation still burned deep in the American heart. Across the ocean, Japan's empire stretched wide. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, all had fallen. It seemed the rising sun would never set. But somewhere east of Japan, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, a secret was stirring, a mission so daring it bordered on madness. The waves slapped against steel as crews moved in hushed urgency. The air was thick with salt and fear. On the flight deck stood a small, determined man, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. His eyes scanned the gray horizon as he addressed his men. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "this mission will be dangerous. We're flying farther than any of us ever have, and we might not come back. But make no mistake, what we do today will be remembered." 80 airmen stood listening, their faces lit by the pale dawn. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers lined the deck, wings stretching over the cold Pacific wind. It was the first time such bombers would ever launch from a carrier deck. No one knew if it was even possible. In the cramped quarters below, Corporal Thomas Greer sat by a dim lamp, writing what might be his final letter. "To my wife," he wrote softly, "by the time you read this, I might be halfway to Japan. Tell our boy his father flew for something bigger than himself." He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket as if it were armor. At dawn, alarms broke the stillness. A Japanese patrol boat had spotted them far too early. The element of surprise was fading. Doolittle didn't hesitate. "We launch now," he ordered. "It's 800 miles to target, maybe more. But we'll hit them." Engines roared to life. Men shouted orders, wind whipped across the deck. The first bomber rolled forward, wheels trembling against the steel. At the very edge of the carrier, it lifted, barely clearing the sea spray. Cheers erupted from the deck crew as the plane disappeared into the horizon. One after another, the 16 bombers clawed their way into the gray clouds, bound for Tokyo. Hours later, after endless stretches of ocean, the Japanese mainland appeared through a break in the clouds. Over the intercom came a pilot's voice, tight with adrenaline, "Tokyo in sight. Targets locked." The sound of anti-aircraft guns filled the air. Sirens wailed across the city. Bombs whistled down upon factories, fuel depots, and military docks. Fires erupted, and panic spread through the streets. For the first time, the Japanese homeland felt the touch of war. In Tokyo's command centers, disbelief rippled through the ranks. "Impossible," one officer stammered, staring at the smoke curling over the skyline. "Americans cannot reach Tokyo." Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood silent for a moment before speaking, his tone low and heavy. "They just did. And this means our defenses are not absolute." Meanwhile, over the vast expanse of sea and storm, Doolittle's men were running out of fuel. They had flown farther than planned. One crew after another radioed in distress. "Mayday, out of fuel. Prepare to bail." Parachutes snapped open over China's darkened hills. Some men crashed into rice fields, others were lost to the sea. Many who survived were captured by Japanese troops in occupied China, interrogated, tortured, and executed. A few made it home, carried across enemy lines by Chinese villagers who risked everything to save them. When Doolittle finally regrouped with his surviving men, he believed he had failed. The raid had caused little damage, and he expected court-martial upon return. But he was wrong. Across America, the news of the attack spread like wildfire. The nation erupted in pride. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, hope had a heartbeat again. The Doolittle Raid had not won a battle. It had lit a spark. A message was sent across the Pacific, that America was not defeated, only awakening. And soon, that awakening would roar back with fire and vengeance at sea. The fires that burned over Tokyo had barely faded when the shock reached Japan's highest command. The impossible had happened. The American mainland bombers had struck the empire itself. In Tokyo's war rooms, faces were pale and voices hushed. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, stared silently at a map spread before him. Every pin on that map represented victory, until now. "We underestimated them," he murmured. "This insult will be repaid in full." Vengeance became the new objective. Yamamoto began to plan a massive operation, one that would lure the U.S. Navy into the open sea and crush it once and for all. The target was a small speck in the Pacific, Midway Atoll. From that point, he believed, Japan could draw out the remnants of the American fleet and deliver the killing blow, but in the shadowed rooms of Pearl Harbor's intelligence division, American cryptanalysts had already begun to unravel Japan's secret codes. For weeks, Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team worked tirelessly, surrounded by cigarette smoke and the constant clatter of typewriters. "They're going for Midway," he told his superiors. "They think it's a trap for us. Let's make it one for them." By early June 1942, both navies were on a collision course. The Pacific was calm, too calm, as the sun rose over the horizon. Aboard the USS Enterprise, pilots prepared their aircraft in tense silence. Some knelt in quiet prayer, others stared at photographs tucked in their cockpits. The air smelled of salt, oil, and fear. "Target sighted," a spotter's voice crackled through the radio. "Multiple carriers. Japanese flag confirmed." The order came quickly: launch all aircraft. Engines thundered to life, propellers slicing the morning air. High above the ocean, American torpedo bombers dove first, brave, low, and hopelessly outmatched. Japanese fighters tore through them, flaming wrecks plunging into the waves. But those sacrifices bought time. Minutes later, from the clouds above, came the next wave, dive bombers screaming down like hawks. "Hold steady," the lead pilot shouted through his radio. "Pick your target, now." Bombs whistled down with terrifying precision. One struck the Kaga, then another the Akagi. Fire and black smoke erupted into the sky. The Soryu followed moments later. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were burning, their decks exploding into twisted steel. Aboard the Japanese flagship, chaos reigned. Sailors ran across flaming decks, screaming orders lost to the roar of destruction. Yamamoto received the reports in stunned silence. 4 carriers, the heart of his fleet, were gone. He closed his eyes and whispered, "The tide has turned." By the end of the day, the battle was decided. Japan's losses were irreplaceable. The once invincible Imperial Navy would never again recover its dominance. The Doolittle Raid, once dismissed as symbolic, had forced Japan into this fatal gamble, and lost. Back in America, the surviving Doolittle Raiders were being hailed as heroes. They had expected punishment but received medals instead. James Doolittle, standing before his men, smiled quietly. "We thought we failed," he said. "But we gave our country hope. That's worth more than victory." Years later, in post-war Japan, historians would look back on those moments with a different understanding. One wrote, "The Doolittle Raid was a warning, a whisper before the storm. It showed that courage, not numbers, defines power." The men who flew that day never called themselves heroes. They were soldiers, aviators, husbands, sons, ordinary men sent on an impossible mission. Some never came home. Others lived long enough to see the peace their bravery helped to create. As time passed and the world changed, their story remained, a testament to how a single spark of defiance can alter the course of history. The sound of those bombers over Tokyo still echoes through time, not as a symbol of destruction, but of resilience, because on that day in April 1942, the world learned a truth that would carry through every battlefield that followed. Courage is not measured by how many return home, it's measured by the will to go, knowing you might never return. And for Japan, the Doolittle Raid was more than a strike. It was a realization that America was not defeated. It was only beginning to fight. The war dragged on, reshaping lives, nations, and destinies with every passing month. After Midway, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. But victory was still a distant dream. The road ahead was paved with sacrifice. American soldiers, sailors, and airmen moved from island to island, fighting through jungles thick with humidity and death. The names of those battles, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, became etched into the memories of those who survived them. On the other side of the Pacific, Japan faced an awakening far harsher than anyone had imagined. Factories struggled to replace lost carriers and aircraft. Pilots were trained quickly, too quickly, to fill the gaps left by Midway's devastation. Families waited anxiously for letters from sons who never returned. And yet, despite their losses, the Japanese people endured with unwavering resolve. For the Doolittle Raiders who remained in the fight, the war never truly left them. Some returned to the skies, joining new bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific. Others were reassigned, carrying the weight of memory, of comrades lost in China, of the uncertainty that surrounded their impossible mission. They watched the world they knew dissolve into a conflict far larger than anyone could have predicted. As American forces advanced, the Japanese military doubled down on its defenses. Kamikaze attacks began, desperate acts born from the belief that honor demanded sacrifice. American sailors watched in horror as planes plunged from the sky, engines screaming, into the decks of ships. It was a brutal reminder that even a cornered enemy could strike with ferocity. Through it all, the spirit ignited by the Doolittle Raid lingered. In every briefing room, in every bunker, in every cockpit, it served as a reminder that even a small act of defiance could change the momentum of war. Pilots preparing for dangerous missions often spoke of the raiders. If Doolittle's boys could take off from a carrier in a bomber, they'd say, tightening their straps, "We can make it through this." In Japan, Yamamoto, once seen as the mastermind of victory, faced the consequences of a war turning against his nation. His fleets were battered, his pilots exhausted, and his resources dwindling. When his aircraft was shot down in 1943, many felt the sense of inevitability settle over the empire. The war he had helped shape was slipping beyond control. By 1945, the Pacific was engulfed in flames. American B-29 superfortresses soared over Japanese cities, including the very place the Doolittle Raiders had struck years earlier. Fires consumed entire blocks. Families huddled in shelters as the sky glowed orange. The cost of war, on all sides, was now undeniable. When the war finally ended in August, the world exhaled. Streets filled with celebrations, parades, and tears. Soldiers returned home to families who had waited years. Among them were the surviving Doolittle Raiders, greeted not as soldiers who had completed a mission, but as symbols of a nation's resilience. They gathered together year after year, aging quietly, sharing stories that grew heavier with time. At each reunion, they left a single empty chair for the men who never came home. In Japan, survivors looked upon the ruins of once thriving cities and reflected on the choices that led them there. Many spoke of the Doolittle Raid as the moment they understood the war might not end in triumph. It was a memory that stayed with them, painful but necessary, a reminder that pride can blind even the strongest empire. As decades passed, the story of the raid became a bridge between two nations once locked in conflict. Former enemies shook hands, traded memories, and honored the dead together. For both sides, it was a symbol not of destruction, but of transformation. In the twilight years of the raiders, one of them, frail, holding a cane, stood before a gathering of young aviators. His voice was soft, but carried the weight of history. "We weren't heroes," he said. "We were scared. We didn't know if we'd make it home. But courage," he paused, tapping his chest, "isn't about not being afraid. It's about moving forward anyway." The young pilots listened in silence. Some would go on to new conflicts, others to peaceful skies. But all carried his words with them. The legacy of the Doolittle Raid lived on, etched not just in history books, but in the hearts of those who believed that even in the darkest hour, a single spark could change the course of the world. It was a story of daring, of sacrifice, of fear and resilience. A story shared by enemies and allies alike, and long after the last raider passed on, the echo of those 16 bombers still drifts across the Pacific, reminding the world that courage, once awakened, can reshape history itself.